200 motorcycles rolled down the access road, engines drowning out the announcer, and every parent in those bleachers turned to look. Nobody had told the head coach they were coming. Nobody had told him why. He just stood there at home plate, line-up card shaking in his hand, watching 200 strangers in leather vests walk toward the stands like they owned the night. Weeks earlier, he'd cut an 18-year-old boy with Down syndrome after giving him exactly 6 pitches to prove himself. Now, the boy was standing in the on-deck circle, and the coach was about to learn exactly how wrong he'd been. In front of every single person who mattered, Tommy Bennett had memorized the tryout schedule the way other people memorized song lyrics. Tuesday, March 3rd, 4 o'clock, Fairview High School baseball diamond. He'd written it on a sticky note and pressed it to his bedroom mirror 11 days ago, and every morning since he'd read it aloud while brushing his teeth, like a promise he was making before anyone else got the chance to break it. He was 18, 6 weeks from graduating, and he had never once made a school sports team, not in middle school when coaches smiled politely and said maybe next season. Not as a freshman, cut before he threw a single pitch. Not as a sophomore or junior, when tryouts became something his mother stopped mentioning because watching his face fall afterward hurt worse than the rejection itself. This year was supposed to be different. Tommy had spent the winter in the side yard of their rented house on Delacroix Street, throwing a rubber-coated baseball against the garage wall until his arm ached and the paint wore down to a smooth grey patch. He'd practiced his swing in the kitchen so often, his mother finally moved the fruit bowl out of range. Lisa Bennett worked 12-hour shifts on the cardiac floor at Vanderbilt University Medical Center and came home most nights smelling of hand sanitizer and exhaustion. She was 46 and had raised Tommy alone since he was 3, when his father decided a son with Down syndrome wasn't the life he'd signed up for and left a note instead of a conversation. Lisa had burned that note in the sink the same night. Some things she believed a boy didn't need to carry. What Tommy carried instead was a quiet, stubborn hope that refused to die no matter how many doors closed on him. He loved baseball with the uncomplicated devotion of someone who had never learned to protect himself by loving something less. "You nervous?" Lisa asked that Tuesday morning, watching him eat cereal in the low gold light of the kitchen window. "A little," Tommy admitted, because he tried hard to always tell the truth. "Coach Whitmore said everybody gets a fair shot this year. It's a new policy. The school board made him." Lisa knew the policy well, an inclusion clause added to the athletic handbook after 2 years of meetings and 1 school board session, where she'd stood at a podium, hands shaking, and read a letter Tommy had written about wanting just once to wear the Fairview jersey. The board had voted 5-2. For a few weeks that winter, it had felt like a victory, but Lisa had met Chris Whitmore twice, and both times he'd shaken her hand with the firmness of a man who wanted the conversation over quickly. He was 47, in his 9th season as head coach, and Fairview hadn't missed the state playoffs once under him. A policy from the school board was, to him, an obstacle to manage, not a door to open. "A policy doesn't guarantee a spot," Lisa said. "It guarantees a tryout." "I know," Tommy said. "That's all I want, a real one." Nearly 40 boys turned out for the 3-day tryout. Tommy arrived early each time, in second-hand cleats Lisa had polished until they looked new, and an old Rawlings glove that had belonged to his uncle. He ran sprints, finishing ahead of 2 boys who'd clearly signed up on a dare. He fielded ground balls. 3 clean, 2 thrown true to first, 1 bobbled off the heel of his glove, which drew a ripple of laughter from near the dugout that he let pass through him without turning around. Then came batting practice, the part he'd trained for all winter. He stepped into the box, dug in his back foot the way his uncle had taught him, let a high pitch go by, and on the second pitch connected with a solid crack that sent the ball arcing into shallow right field. A clean single. For 1 full second, standing in the March sunlight, Tommy Bennett felt like exactly what he was, a baseball player. Coach Whitmore, watching from the first baseline, didn't write anything down. He looked at his clipboard and moved to the next name. Over 3 days, Tommy counted his own pitches, 6 total, while other boys got 20 or more. Results went up at 7 a.m. on the gymnasium bulletin board. Tommy had asked his mother not to come. He wanted to read the list the way every other boy would. 22 names. He read it once, then again slowly, in case his eyes had skipped a line. Bennett wasn't there. He walked to Whitmore's office. The coach looked up from a stat sheet. "I didn't make the list," Tommy said, his voice steadier than he expected. "You worked hard," Whitmore said, "but I've got 22 spots and 40 kids competing for them, and I have to build a team that can win a title. It's not personal. It's baseball. I got a hit. Off the second pitch. A clean single. 1 hit in 3 days isn't a big enough sample, son. Is it because of my Down syndrome?" Tommy asked plainly. Not as an accusation, just a question he'd never learned to hide, because hiding it never made the answer kinder. Whitmore's jaw tightened. "The policy required a tryout. I gave you one. That's what fair means. Fair doesn't mean everybody makes the team." Tommy stood, something hot and heavy settling behind his sternum. "Thank you for the tryout, coach," he said, because his mother had raised him polite, even when it cost him, and he walked out past the bulletin board and its 22 names into a cold Thursday morning that didn't care that something in him had just quietly broken. He didn't call his mother. He walked the 2 miles home instead, past the auto body shop on Charlotte Pike, where a row of motorcycles always sat gleaming in the sun, and by the time he reached Delacroix Street, his eyes were dry, because Tommy Bennett had also learned, across 18 patient years, exactly how to carry disappointment without letting it show. That night, he took the sticky note off his mirror, folded it twice, and buried it beneath a stack of baseball cards in his nightstand drawer, where it would be easy not to see. What Tommy didn't know was that his story had already left his hands. A woman at the auto body shop on Charlotte Pike had watched him field ground balls through the chain-link fence 3 days earlier and gone home to tell her husband about the kid who kept getting up every time the ball got past him. Her husband's name was Steve Coleman, and he ran something in this town that Chris Whitmore, for all his championships, had no idea how to compete with. 200 people who showed up for one of their own, no matter how the world had judged him first. Steve Coleman was 54 years old, built like a man who had spent 30 years turning wrenches and lifting engine blocks, with a grey beard down to his collarbone and forearms sleeved in faded tattoos from a life he didn't talk about much anymore. He was president of the Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club, a chapter of 40-some riders who met on Wednesday nights at a clubhouse off Charlotte Pike that used to be a tire shop. To most of Nashville, the Iron Wolves were exactly what their leather vests and loud pipes suggested, something to cross the street to avoid. What most of Nashville didn't know was that the Iron Wolves ran a toy drive every December that outfitted 3 elementary schools. They escorted funeral processions for veterans who had no family left to walk behind the hearse. 2 years ago, when a member's teenage daughter was going through chemotherapy, 40 bikes had shown up outside Vanderbilt Children's Hospital just to rev their engines under her window because she'd said, half joking, that she missed the sound. Steve's wife, Karen Coleman, ran the front desk at the auto body shop where the club did informal business between rides, and it was Karen who told him about the boy that Thursday evening over dinner. "There's a kid who's been coming by the ball field behind the shop every day for weeks," she said, "practicing on his own before the season even starts. Down syndrome, I think. Moves different. But Lord, Steve, the effort in that kid. He must have thrown 200 pitches against a wall today." Steve had grunted, half listening, until Karen mentioned the tryout. "Fairview's supposed to be doing that new inclusion thing this year, the one the school board passed." "They better not be doing it for show," Steve said, setting down his fork. He didn't think much more about it until 3 days later, When Karen came home from the shop with her jaw set in a particular way he recognized from 26 years of marriage, the look she got when something had made her angry on someone else's behalf. "They cut him," she said. "The boy, Tommy. I saw him walking home past the shop this afternoon, and I swear, Steve, he was trying so hard not to let his face show it, and it broke my heart clean in half." Steve set down the wrench he'd been holding. "Cut him how? They gave him a real shot." "I don't know the details. I just know a mother came into the shop an hour later asking if we did engine work, and it turned out to be his mother, and she was crying in the parking lot before she even got out of her car, Lisa Bennett. I gave her coffee and let her sit a while." Steve was quiet for a long moment. He thought about his own son, Danny, who'd played travel ball for years and never once had to prove he deserved to be on a field. He thought about the sound of a boy throwing 200 pitches against a garage wall, alone because nobody had given him anywhere better to throw them. "Get me her number," Steve said. "I want to talk to her." Lisa Bennett was suspicious when Steve Coleman called. A biker club president asking to meet about her son was not, in her experience, a call that led anywhere good. But something in his voice on the phone, careful, direct, no bravado in it at all, made her agree to meet him at the diner on Charlotte Pike the following evening. Steve arrived in his cut, the Iron Wolves patch on his back, and Lisa watched two other diner customers visibly tense when he walked in. He noticed it too. He always did. "I'm not here to cause you trouble, Mrs. Bennett," he said, sliding into the booth across from her. "My wife told me about your son, about the tryout." Lisa's arms were crossed. "With respect, Mr. Coleman, I don't see what this has to do with your club." "Maybe nothing," Steve admitted. "But I've been part of this town a long time, and I've watched a lot of people get written off before they got a real chance to show what they've got. My club's spent 20 years trying to be more than what people assume when they see us on the highway. Maybe that means something here. Maybe it doesn't. I just wanted to hear it from you. What happened at that tryout, before I made up my mind about anything." So Lisa told him. About the policy, about the 6 pitches over 3 days, while other boys got 20, about the bobbled ball and the laughter from the dugout, about Whitmore's office and the question Tommy had asked him, "Is it because of my Down syndrome?" And the answer that hadn't really been an answer at all. Steve listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening the same way Karen's had over dinner 3 nights before. He asked the coach straight to his face. Steve said finally. "That's Tommy," Lisa said, and for the first time that evening, something like a smile crossed her tired face. "He doesn't know how to ask things any other way." Steve sat with that for a moment, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table. "Mrs. Bennett, I want to meet your son. Not to make a scene, not to cause the school trouble, just to meet him, and then I'm going to make a phone call or two, and we'll see what this town's really made of." Lisa studied his face for a long moment, the grey beard, the tattoos, the eyes that had gone soft the second he started talking about his own son, and something in her, worn down by 18 years of doors closing on Tommy, decided to trust him. "He'd like that," she said. "He likes people who tell him the truth." "Then we'll get along fine," Steve said, "because that's the only thing I know how to do." That night, Steve went home and sat at his kitchen table with his laptop open and his phone in his hand, and he started making calls, first to Marcus, his vice president, then to 3 other chapter presidents he knew across Middle Tennessee, then to a woman named Michelle, who ran a non-profit connected to youth sports advocacy and had helped push through the inclusion policy in the first place. By midnight, Steve Coleman had a plan that had nothing to do with confronting Chris Whitmore and everything to do with making sure Tommy Bennett never again stood alone on a baseball field, wondering if anybody was watching who cared. Tommy met Steve Coleman on a Saturday morning in the gravel lot behind the Iron Wolves clubhouse, where his mother drove him after Steve called to invite them both for what he described only as a chance to talk baseball. Tommy had been nervous in the car. Bikers were something he mostly knew from movies, loud and leather-clad and unsmiling. But when Steve walked out of the clubhouse to meet them, he didn't look unsmiling at all. He looked like a man who'd been waiting for this exact conversation. "You're the kid who hit a single off 6 pitches," Steve said, extending a hand the size of a dinner plate. Tommy shook it, startled. "You heard about that?" "My wife saw you practicing behind the shop for weeks before tryouts even started. 200 throws a day," she said. "That true?" "Sometimes more," Tommy admitted. Steve nodded slowly, like Tommy had confirmed something important. "I want to show you something," he said, and led them around back of the clubhouse, where a cracked but serviceable batting cage sat behind the garage. An old one, netting patched in 3 places, but a real cage with a pitching machine that still worked. Belonged to a member's kid who aged out of Little League. Been sitting here collecting dust for 2 years. Figure it's time it got some use. Tommy stared at it. "For me?" "For anybody who wants to work," Steve said. "You want to work?" "Yes, sir," Tommy said, and something in his voice made Lisa, standing a few feet back, press the back of her hand to her mouth. Over the following 2 weeks, Tommy showed up at the Iron Wolves clubhouse 3 afternoons after school, and Steve, who, it turned out, had coached his own son's travel teams for a decade before Danny went off to college, worked with him on his swing, his footwork, the small mechanical adjustments that separated a lucky hit from a repeatable one. Other members drifted over during these sessions, curious at first, then invested. A man named Frank, missing 2 fingers from a shop accident, turned out to have pitched semi-pro ball in his 20s and started throwing batting practice most days. A woman named Rhonda, who rode with the club and worked as a physical therapist, watched Tommy's footwork for exactly 1 session and quietly redesigned his fielding drills to build up the specific muscle groups that gave him trouble. Word moved through the club the way it always did, fast, and without anyone deciding officially that it should. By the 2nd week, it wasn't unusual for 6 or 7 members to be leaning on the fence around the cage on a Tuesday afternoon, calling out encouragement, arguing good-naturedly about Tommy's stance. "You're getting good," Steve told him one afternoon, after Tommy had lined 3 straight pitches into the net. "Real good." "I still didn't make the team," Tommy said. It wasn't bitter. It was just true, the way most things Tommy said were just true. Steve leaned against the cage fence. "You know what I think, Tommy. I think Coach Whitmore made a decision about you before he ever saw you swing a bat. I think he looked at a piece of paper with a diagnosis on it and decided he already knew everything he needed to know." "Everybody does that," Tommy said, without self-pity, just an observation from 18 years of collecting the evidence. "Teachers, coaches, kids at school. They look at me and decide before I even say anything." "Yeah," Steve said quietly. "People do that to us too, you know. Big fella in leather rolls into a diner, and half the room decides we're trouble before we order coffee. 20 years I've been trying to prove people wrong about that. 1 Toys for Tots drive at a time." He paused. "Maybe that's why this feels like it matters. Somebody's got to prove people wrong. Might as well be us, doing it together." Tommy considered this with the same careful seriousness he considered most things. "Do you think Coach Whitmore will change his mind?" "I don't know," Steve said honestly. "But I don't think that's really the point anymore. You're not swinging that bat to change his mind. You're swinging it because you love the game and you deserve a place to play it, whether he ever admits he was wrong or not." Meanwhile, Chris Whitmore's season had started well. Fairview was 4-0, ranked in the top 10 in the state for their division, and he had, by his own account, put the Tommy Bennett situation entirely behind him. He had a roster to manage, a district title to defend, boosters to answer to. When his assistant coach mentioned, almost as an aside, that some motorcycle club had been seen practicing with "that kid who got cut" over on Charlotte Pike, Whitmore only shrugged. "Not my problem what he does on his own time," he said. "I gave him a fair tryout. Some kids just don't have it. That's baseball." But a week later, his athletic director, a soft-spoken man named Jeff Marsh, stopped him in the hallway with a strange look on his face. "You seen the school Facebook page today?" Jeff asked. "Can't say I have." "Somebody posted a video. Kid hitting off a pitching machine at some biker clubhouse. 40, 50 comments already. People are asking why he's not on our team." Whitmore felt something tighten in his chest that he didn't examine too closely. "It's a video of a kid practicing. Doesn't mean anything." "Maybe not," Jeff said, "but people are talking about it, Chris. And people around here don't forget things easy." Whitmore walked back to his office and closed the door. And for the first time since the tryout, he found himself thinking not about batting averages or playoff seeding, but about the exact words he'd used in that meeting. Fair doesn't mean everybody makes the team. And how, said out loud in his own memory now, they sounded less like a coaching philosophy and more like an excuse he'd reached for because it was easier than admitting the truth. He had never given Tommy Bennett 6 pitches meant to evaluate him. He had given him 6 pitches meant to get through the tryout without controversy, and the boy had hit one of them clean anyway. The idea came from Michelle Ferris, the non-profit director who'd helped push through Fairview's inclusion policy 2 years earlier. She'd heard about Tommy through a mutual contact and called Steve directly. "There's a scrimmage in 3 weeks," she told him. "Fairview's playing an exhibition against Franklin County to open up the district showcase. College scouts, local news, the works. Big crowd expected. What if Tommy wasn't in the stands watching? What if he was the reason people showed up in the first place?" Steve turned the idea over slowly, the way he turned over every plan before committing the club to it. "You're talking about bringing the wolves out, in force. I'm talking about showing Coach Whitmore and everybody else in those stands that Tommy Bennett has more people in his corner than he'll ever admit to needing. Sometimes that's the only language that gets through to people who've already made up their minds." Steve called a full chapter meeting that Wednesday night. 40 members crowded into the clubhouse, and Steve laid it out plainly. A boy had been cut from his school team, likely because of a diagnosis nobody had bothered to actually evaluate on its merits. And the club had an opportunity to show up. Not to cause trouble, not to threaten anybody, just to be present, loud and visible, on the night that mattered most. "We ride out to that scrimmage," Steve said. "Not for a fight. For a boy who spent his whole life proving himself to people who never gave him a fair look. We show up, we sit in those stands, and we let this whole town see exactly who's got Tommy Bennett's back." The vote was unanimous, but it didn't stay contained to one chapter. Steve made calls to presidents of 3 neighboring clubs, men and women he'd ridden with for decades, people who understood instinctively what it meant when one of their own decided something mattered. Within a week, word had spread through Middle Tennessee's riding community the way it always did, fast, informal, and impossible to stop once it started moving. A women's riding group out of Murfreesboro signed on. A veterans motorcycle association from Clarksville said they'd bring 40 bikes of their own. By the time the scrimmage date arrived, Steve's rough head count had climbed past 150 and kept climbing. Lisa didn't tell Tommy the scale of what was coming. She only told him 2 days before that some friends from the Iron Wolves wanted to come watch him at the scrimmage, because even though he hadn't made the roster, Steve had arranged through Jeff Marsh and the athletic department for Tommy to be added as a guest player for 1 inning of the exhibition game, a courtesy gesture the department had agreed to under mounting pressure it didn't fully understand yet. Whitmore had approved it reluctantly, assuming it would be a quiet, forgettable moment, buried in an exhibition nobody outside the program would care about. He had badly misjudged how many people had started caring. The night of the scrimmage, Chris Whitmore arrived at the field 2 hours early, as he always did, and found the parking lot already unusually full. He assumed it was early arrivals for the showcase. Scouts, maybe, or eager parents. It wasn't until he walked toward the field and heard it, a low mechanical rumble, building steadily in the distance, like weather rolling in, that he understood something else was happening. They came in formation down Fairview's main access road, not a scattered handful, but wave after wave of motorcycles, headlights on even in daylight, engines a steady thunder that drew people out of the concession stand and off the bleachers to watch. 200 bikes, by the count, the local news crew later confirmed, filling the overflow lot and lining the road beyond it. Riders dismounting in leather vests, bearing a dozen different club patches, filing toward the stands in a slow, deliberate procession. Whitmore stood near the dugout, stunned into stillness, watching Steve Coleman walk toward him at the head of the group. "Mr. Whitmore," Steve said, extending a hand. "Steve Coleman. I believe you know Tommy Bennett." Whitmore shook the hand automatically, his mind still catching up. "I do. He's playing an inning tonight. As a guest." "We heard," Steve said evenly. "We came to watch him play." "All of you? All 200 of us, give or take." Steve's expression was calm, almost pleasant, but there was something underneath it that made Whitmore's throat go dry. "We're not here to make trouble, Coach. We're here because a boy worked all winter, throwing a ball against a garage wall by himself, and we figured he shouldn't have to walk onto a field, wondering if anybody in the stands actually wanted him there. So we came. Nothing more complicated than that." Whitmore looked past him, at the stands filling steadily with leather and chrome, at families who'd come for the Scouts now craning their necks to watch the procession, at local news, setting up a second camera angle to catch it. Somewhere behind him, in the dugout, he could hear his own players murmuring, some of them pulling out phones. That's a lot of people for one inning," Whitmore managed. "He's earned a lot of people," Steve said simply. He didn't wait for a response. He walked toward the stands, and Whitmore watched him go, watched the riders find seats, not clustered off to one side the way he might have expected, but spread through the bleachers among the regular families, striking up conversations with parents who, 20 minutes earlier, would have crossed a parking lot to avoid them. A woman named Rhonda sat down next to an elderly man in a Fairview booster cap and asked him with genuine interest how long he'd been coming to games. Frank, missing 2 fingers from his shop accident, ended up trading baseball stories with a scout from a junior college 2 rows up, both of them laughing within 5 minutes like old friends. Lisa found Tommy near the dugout gate, dressed in a borrowed Fairview practice jersey a size too big, staring out at the stands with his mouth slightly open. "Mom," he said, "are all these people here for me?" "I think a lot of them are, baby," Lisa said, her own voice unsteady. "I don't know any of them." "You know Steve. You know Karen and Frank and Rhonda. The rest just heard about you and decided you mattered." She squeezed his shoulder. "That's the kind of thing that happens sometimes when you work as hard as you've worked." Tommy watched a while longer, and something in his face shifted. Not the careful, patient neutrality he'd worn for 18 years of closed doors, but something looser, something closer to belief. By the time the 3rd inning ended, and Whitmore's assistant waved Tommy toward the on-deck circle for his guest appearance, the crowd noise had built into something the stadium had never held before, a low, rolling roar of 200 engines worth of people who had ridden across 3 counties for exactly this moment, and Whitmore, watching from the dugout with a lineup card gone damp in his hand, understood with sudden, uncomfortable clarity that whatever happened at the plate, in the next few minutes, this night no longer belonged to him or his scoreboard at all. Tommy walked to the on-deck circle with his uncle's old Rawlings glove tucked under his arm, though he wouldn't need it until the field switched sides. He was batting first, playing right field after. His legs felt strange beneath him, not weak exactly, just unfamiliar, the way legs feel in a dream where the ground isn't quite solid. He found Steve's face in the crowd first, near the third base line, arms crossed, watching him with the same steady attention he'd brought to every session in the batting cage behind the clubhouse. Steve caught his eye and gave a small nod. The same nod he gave after every clean swing. Nothing dramatic, just a man confirming what he already believed to be true. The Fairview pitcher on the mound was a sophomore named Danny Coleman, no relation to Steve, a coincidence Tommy had noticed weeks ago and found strangely comforting. And the crowd noise dropped as Tommy stepped into the batter's box, dug his back foot into the dirt the way his uncle had taught him years before anyone from the Iron Wolves ever touched a bat with him. The first pitch came in low. Tommy let it go. Ball 1. Somewhere in the stands, a single motorcycle horn sounded, and then, as if given permission, others joined it. Not a roar, just scattered encouragement, warm and a little chaotic, the sound of 200 people who had decided, individually and all at once, that this moment deserved noise. The second pitch caught the outside corner. Tommy swung, connected, and sent a sharp line drive past the diving second baseman into right center field. He was running before the ball landed, something his months in the cage had built into instinct. And by the time the outfielder had tracked it down and thrown it in, Tommy was standing on second base with a stand-up double, chest heaving, grinning in a way that made Lisa, watching from the front row with her hands pressed over her mouth, finally let herself cry. The stands came apart. 200 engines worth of people on their feet, and Fairview's own students and families right there with them, all of it blending into a single wall of sound that rolled across the field and settled somewhere behind Tommy's ribs, like something he would carry for the rest of his life. Whitmore, standing at the dugout rail, found himself clapping before he'd consciously decided to. He looked down the bench at his own roster, at 22 players on their feet cheering for a boy who wasn't one of them, and felt something in his chest that he recognized, uncomfortably, as shame. Tommy played the bottom of the inning in right field, and it stayed quiet out there. No ball came his way, which Steve later joked was either bad luck or divine mercy, because Tommy would have caught it either way. When the half-inning ended and Tommy jogged off the field, Whitmore was waiting near the dugout entrance, and he did something he hadn't planned to do, hadn't rehearsed, hadn't fully decided on until his feet were already moving toward it. He put out his hand. "That was a hell of a double, Tommy." Tommy shook it, surprised. "Thank you, Coach." Whitmore held on to the handshake a moment longer than necessary, looking for words that didn't come easily to a man who'd spent 9 seasons believing that fairness and kindness were separate categories, that you could give someone the first without ever owing them the second. "I was wrong," he said finally quietly, so only Tommy could hear it over the settling crowd noise. "About the tryout, about the pitches I gave you. I told myself I was being fair. And I wasn't. I'm sorry." Tommy considered this with the same careful seriousness he brought to most things. "It's okay, Coach," he said, and Whitmore, half braced for anger he would have deserved, found instead something that looked almost like relief crossing the boy's face. "Everybody gets to change their mind. That's what my mom says." Whitmore, who had built 9 seasons and a state championship on the belief that some things were simply outside a coach's control, found he had no answer for that except the truth. "Your mom sounds like a smart woman." "She is," Tommy said. 3 weeks later, Fairview's athletic department announced a formal review of its walk-on evaluation procedures, with Jeff Marsh overseeing new guidelines that required documented equal opportunity for every tryout participant, regardless of ability. A policy with teeth this time, not just words on a handbook page. Whitmore, to the surprise of several boosters, volunteered to help write it, spending 2 long evenings in Jeff's office arguing over language until it said exactly what it needed to say instead of what was easiest to defend. "You didn't have to do that," Jeff told him the night they finally signed off on the draft. "Yeah, I did," Whitmore said. "Took me 9 seasons and 200 motorcycles to figure that out. but I did. Tommy didn't make Fairview's varsity roster that spring. He was, realistically, still developing as a player, and both Steve and Lisa were careful never to let the moment at the scrimmage convince him otherwise. His growth, they agreed, deserved to be honest, not performed. But Whitmore created something new that season, an assistant coaching role for the JV program built specifically around Tommy's strengths, working with younger players on fundamentals 3 afternoons a week. Tommy took to it immediately, patient in a way few 18-year-olds were, and by May, the JV players had started calling him Coach Bennett, half joking at first, and then not joking at all. The batting cage behind the Iron Wolves clubhouse never came down. Other kids started showing up on weekends, some with disabilities of their own, some without, word having spread the way it always did in that part of Charlotte Pike, that there was a place where nobody looked at you and decided in advance what you were capable of. On the last Saturday before graduation, Tommy stood in that cage with Steve beside him, watching a 9-year-old with cerebral palsy take his first clean swing at a slow-pitched ball, and Steve caught Tommy's eye the way he had that night at the scrimmage. A small nod, nothing dramatic, a man confirming what he already believed to be true. "You did that," Steve said, nodding at the kid whooping with joy near home plate. "That's you, right there." Tommy watched the boy round the imaginary bases, arms up, and felt something settle in his chest that 18 years of closed doors had never quite managed to take from him. "I just wanted someone to give me a real chance," he said. "I didn't know I'd get to give it to somebody else, too." Steve put a heavy hand on his shoulder, the same steady weight it had been from the very first day. "That's the whole thing, kid," he said. "That's the whole thing right there."